Namaskar. Good afternoon. Well, first of all, I repeat the compliments in terms of this is my first visit to the campus, and it's very modern, and as it should be. In fact, in many ways, watching Republic is pretty much like watching the pathway to Viksit Bharat 2047. Very much, the experiences that this group is going to witness over the next few decades is completely aligned with what we are aspiring for the nation as a whole. So my compliments to the Republic team, and thank you for this opportunity. Well, let me first start by, I had the great privilege to listen to Amitabh's opening lecture. I will build on that. Of course, 2014, if you look at any kind of data, there have been structural breaks from 2014. So I think first it's important to recognize that we are on a pathway to 2047, but 2014 has marked a shift. That shift is not just in terms of looking at structural breaks in one or two indicators, which is why as an economist, I term it as an epoch. And I'm going to show and talk to you about why 2014 onwards, the pathway, in terms of not just growth, real growth, but in terms of the outcomes that growth is meant to achieve, has happened across India. First of all, before 2014, if you visited Delhi, you would often hear the phrase, India has missed the manufacturing bus. It is a very common phrase that people would repeat. And for those of us who were watching and working on India's development, it would often strike as being very odd that how can a country of 1.4 billion want to make a transition and become a model of development by going from agriculture to services, by completely overlooking what is the bedrock of livelihoods and job creation. But such was the nature of policy making. And the reason I'm telling you this part of the story is what does policy making then entail? It's not just about smart policies. You also have to socialize these, because a very large segment of people advising as experts are also myopic and tend to have a very narrow vision of this massive dynamic economy. India should be viewed as 28 vibrant state economies. Okay? Labor laws, yes, there are many things we are doing at the center. Eventually, the penny drops at the state level. Data has already shown that states which have proactively tried to reform have always availed and taken advantage of big trade agreements that India enters. So when market opportunities open, who can really benefit? Not everybody. It's the states which are eventually going to do proper and committed implementation of the policies that we are trying to push from Delhi. So state level also matters a great deal. If you look at the world today, it's a very different world than it was even in 2014, right? Increased amount of protectionism. Of course, the euphemism from economic point of view, we call it industrial policy, which is a very nice, fancy sounding term, but it basically means the governments are going to spend big money to get jobs back, manufacturing back, right? And government after government in the OECD nations are in fact doing exactly that. If you look at the nature of trade protection, in fact, if you look at the top 10 economies of the world and see what has happened in the last 10 years, we are the least protectionist. We have brought in less than 2,000 trade distortionary policies. You know how many the US has brought in? Close to 10,000. How many China has brought in? Do you know? Close to 8,000. So India is really very small if you look at just the number of protection or trying to protect certain kinds of livelihoods. But of course, the nature of those protections that these large economies are doing are in the form of non-tariff barriers, which means enormous amounts of subsidies for export promotion or industrial growth, etc. right? So the nature of it. So when you look at the data, try to go into the details of some of this. The countries that have grown ahead of us, when many people tell us, if East Asia did it, India should also try and emulate the same. Well, India is not a small economy. That's number one. And also understand that none of these East Asian countries, whether it is Japan or South Korea, they haven't done it with this degree of freedom. And I mean maintaining sovereignty. There always has been erosion of sovereignty because technology transfer has meant that these nations have aligned themselves with large global powers. That is the nature of technology transfer. So please recognize what we are trying to do today in India is being fiercely independent, not wanting to be part of one bloc or the other. From a per capita income where we have just come out of poverty, we are a low middle income country, we are trying to do this leapfrog. We are well on our path to doing that. But of course, 7% growth cannot be normalized. We are aspiring for double digit. That is why you will see continuous reforms. That is our job, to continuously keep making things simpler, which means reducing the cost of doing business. So what has changed after 2014? If I just look at impact of growth, let's say poverty numbers, because eventually in a democracy, growth cannot be exclusive in nature. It's not sustainable. It's not sustainable from a society perspective. So growth has to percolate down to household welfare, meaning quality of life of average citizens. Poverty matters a great deal. Now, different forms of poverty has existed. No, as you get more affluent, your definition of poverty also gets changed. It relaxes. You put more things into it. Initially, poverty was only linked to destitution. If you were hungry, you were poor. That was the Tendulkar poverty line, that you needed to consume certain amount of food. Then we moved to what we call the Rangarajan poverty line, which is not just food, so it's not just destitution. It is healthcare, education, conveyance, rental for urban areas. So you see the basket is getting bigger. So now we are talking moderate poverty. It's no longer extreme poverty. And if you just look at the Rangarajan poverty, what do you notice? That in India, nearly 30%, 29.5, 30% households fell below poverty line in 11-12. Do you know what that number is today? It's 3.6%. That has not happened on its own. That's number one. That this is a remarkable decline, unprecedented in human history, and definitely unprecedented from an open, democratic society. We don't know. The numbers in China on an average are very, very remarkable. But what we don't know are how things are distributed there. In India, you do. In India, you have seen state after state, rural after urban. In fact, there's a convergence of rural and urban quality of life and consumption levels. There's a great convergence happening. So poverty is falling for everyone. You want to break it up across religious groups, because there is always a great deal of interest in the Western media that this is a majoritarian country and it doesn't care for its minority, etc. The data allows you to see what is happening to the welfare and the quality of life of different demographics. So if you look at the poverty, for instance, urban poverty for Muslim households used to be very high, almost 40% 10 years back. Poverty for scheduled tribe used to be nearly 50%. All those numbers are way down. It's around 5 or 6% today. So there is great convergence happening across demographic, whether religious groups, social groups, urban, rural, cross-state. That is what growth is meant to achieve. It's meant to be inclusive. And inclusive growth, therefore, if you see past 2014, we are achieving it in terms of these simple metrics. You know, in terms of actual number of people, what is that number? 302 million people have come out of poverty in India. It's not a small achievement, it's massive. I want to also tell you another thing. When people often compare us with China, they compare the GDP. No, GDP, they are almost 5 times our size, yes. And then when you deflate it by the population, you say the per capita income, well, they are 4.5 times to 5 times as rich as India. But do you know how that GDP is distributed? Private consumption is China. In China is only 1.5 times more than private consumption in India, which means an average Indian's quality of life is just a little lower than the Chinese quality of life today. Which means the additional GDP that is getting generated is with the state and is with corporations. Please appreciate that a free democratic society that you have has meant that the GDP is being enjoyed or is part of your quality of life. It doesn't sit with corporations and the state alone. It's very important for people to understand, because most of you only compare GDP sizes. Some of you will deflate it and look at population numbers, but that does not tell you the truth. All right? In terms of quality of life, the difference is not that vast. And of course, it's largely on account of the fact that we are a democracy, which means the rules are different. We do business very differently from the way Chinese do. Sometimes I hear frustration. Too much democracy in India and things take too much time and so on and so forth. Well, please note, my singular job as an economist is to tell you that there is a trade-off. The trade-off, if you just look at what is happening in terms of your quality of life and how growth is getting distributed, the trade-off comes largely on account of the fact that we are a democratic society. There is no such a thing as a free lunch. It's very important for the youngsters to understand, right? Now, I want to talk a little bit about the whole concept around Atmanirbharta. It's not just a meaningless phrase. It's meant to tell us that there are certain strategic sectors where we do not want to be over-reliant on external forces, right? Food is the first. And for the elders in the room, they will remember just 50 years back, when we wanted certain amount of food because we were struck in a certain hardship, we were denied. But within 50 years, what has happened to food production index of India? It's almost 130, which means of the 100 units that you consume, you produce 130. India today does not have a shortage of food. We have abundance of food. Yes, the quality and nature of that food is shifting. We are all eating less of carbohydrates, including the poorest Indians. Even the poorest Indians now are eating less of carbs and they are eating more of richer, better micronutrients. So if you look at fresh fruits, more than 90% Indians are eating fresh fruits. Why do I care about this? Because it's not like food grains that the government can give. It's also not something which is available throughout the country and throughout the year, which means usually, to even the youngsters in the room, there used to be a lot of seasonality before in consumption of fruits and vegetables. Today, not anymore. Why is that? Because your back-end logistic, the supply chain, the cold storages, the infrastructure development has meant that basic food and perishable items are available throughout the country. There is no district today in India when it comes to food. You would term it as a remote district. Food is available to Indians. So food security is something we can say we have achieved, right? And we are well on our path. Second, energy security. This helps you also appreciate why we took the stance that we do. We continue to take stance that we do. Because amongst the biggest economies in the world, we are the most exposed to imports as far as energy is concerned. 33% of our energy consumed is imported. That's too high, right? The Americans have brought it down after discovery of shale. Now they are in single digits. The Chinese too have now stabilized it around 13-14%. We are around 33%, which means we depend a great deal on external markets for energy needs. Please appreciate this is singularly driving our entire focus towards renewables, why we need to continue to push for renewables. And second, we are not going to grow the way the past OECD markets have grown. That would be terribly irresponsible. It's extremely polluting. It's just not sustainable. So yes, we do hear a lot of hypocrisy when it comes to policy prescriptions, but the reality is that we have to make a commitment, and we have. India is the poorest country amongst the G20. But if you look at the commitments in terms of climate that we have made and the energy transition we have made, no other nation before us has made these kind of responsible commitments and achieved them. We continue to achieve them. So the whole push for life, lifestyle for environment, etc., is really meant to tell you that India's growth is not going to mimic the growth of OECD nations before us. We are going to have our own path because we do have our own objectives. That takes me to the final issue that I'm extremely keen to discuss, but more importantly, we have to work towards improving, is this demographic dividend part of the story. Nations are built by people, not just by capital. And people will mean we need healthy, skilled, educated population. Yes, we are young. That window is there and it's open, and we're trying our best to take complete advantage of that. But the reality is that India's fertility rate has been crashing in unprecedented ways. Today, our fertility rate is well below replacement. In fact, it's below 2. It's around 1.97. This is too fast for a nation which has to grow. We need a large, capable, working population for the next several decades. So for the working population to shrink relative to an elderly population, we have 120 million people above the age of 60. So yes, we are a young nation, but we also have a rapidly increasing elderly share. So to improve and get to a high quality of life, we will need a large working age population. But with this declining fertility and falling rather rapidly, what are the policy prescriptions? Do you know that urban India has had below replacement fertility rate for the last 25 years? So while many people have started talking about fertility today, the reality is, and this is the dynamism of Indian economy, that unless you look at the data and you look at it in granular way, you don't really know what's happening. Most people just think they know India. You need to look at the data in highly granular way. So if urban India, the young women do not want to have children, that is a crisis. And you know what then pushes us further? That during the pandemic, a rather dismal statistics emerged from the rich G7 nations. That this is the first time in human history that such a large number of elderly population have died alone without a family member around. That shakes you up because it tells you that's not the kind of growth we want. Eventually, progress and development has to be defined in a way that we should aspire for. And that's not going to be, therefore, our growth model. China today, the biggest fear they have is they have already grown old before becoming rich. There is no clamor for migration into China, unlike Europe. As Amitabh mentioned, Japan is already quite old. In fact, in Japan today, they are trying to measure labor and age. Age for you and me is a very simple variable. It tells you how old you are. So it's a chronological measure. Not in Japan. In Japan, the conversations are moving to, yes, there is a chronological age, which means I'm 50 years old. But there is a biological age, which means I'm as productive as a 40-year-old. You see, the creativity in terms of thinking and narratives and trying to overcome an almost certain fate on account of not being sensitive to what is happening to fertility is very, very critical for any country. So what does that tell you, therefore? First, our policies have to become, and I must assure you, they are becoming more family-friendly. Because our girls are getting more, I see more women here. The girls are getting more educated than ever. They're working very hard. They outdo the boys not just in 10th and 12th. They outdo them in most undergrad courses as well. But after all that, when it's time to get into the labor market, what happens? You're a traditional society. We still want children. But your traditional family structure doesn't exist anymore. So when traditional family structures are breaking down because you're urbanizing at a pace unprecedented, you're also nuclearizing at a stage, a rate which is unprecedented. So that joint family where grandparents could take care of children and hence young women could go out and work, that luxury, unfortunately, doesn't exist. So if that happens and you want the young women to fulfill their aspiration, there is a role for policy. The government has to step in ways that it can. Therefore, you are seeing a push for all kinds of benefits. In fact, we are making a case for why families have to file taxes as a joint unit. There have to be benefits to taking care of elderly and the young. Children are extremely labor intensive, but so are elders. Do you know an average working age woman in India spends 4 hours every day taking care of someone? So now as an economist, what's the value that they are bringing to the GDP? That's a very easy fix for me to do. I have estimated, and that number is 17%. Yes, it's very large. But in society, what does it mean? That this large amount of value which these women are creating on account of care is in the household. And because it is inside the household, there's no money transacted, we discount it. We don't just discount it in the GDP, we discount it in society. You don't value your women unless they go out and earn a living. But that is not how growth was meant to be even 100 years back. These are very large, critical issues which are staring at us. And you will continue to see that policy evolution is going to address these kind of structural issues. In migration across our states is going to take care of a lot of these problems. You will continue to see great amount of migration from eastern part of the country to the western part, which is far more industrialized and growing in ways that services, etc. is there. But that will still not solve the problem overall of care and what family-friendly policies ought to be, right? Very brief, I want to also spend a little bit of time making you appreciate that what has happened in the rural areas of India is nothing short of revolutionary since 2014. Many of you might have heard about declining labor force participation of women. How many of you know that in the last 8 years, rural India has witnessed a 70% increase in female labor force participation? It's massive. It has largely happened on the back of policy push. Whether it's your Drone Didi, Lakhpati Didi, self-help groups, there are a string of schemes. Of course, on the back of the fact that almost all amenities are keeping women at the heart of the family. So whether it is the housing scheme, Awas Yojana, 70% titles, ownership is in the names of women. Because women accessing or having access to ownership of asset is remarkable, not just for them, but for the family as a whole. It directly leads to better health and education outcome for the children. So these are long-term strategic issues that we are solving by basically targeting the right people within the family, because it's for the betterment of the society as a whole. One last, my favorite story on narratives and why I'm here to lend support to a media house. You know, narrative economics, and I encourage you to read the book by Robert Shiller, a Nobel awardee. Narrative economics used to be within the confines of corporate finance. That, you know, companies used to float stories about their rivals, or they would float stories about themselves to impact the stock price. Today, narrative economics is not within the limits or confines of corporate finance. Today, it's the lived reality of geoeconomics and geopolitics. So when we looked at Google data, GDEL data, And we started to look at hundreds of millions of data points from across the world, and we started to see how does global media cover different countries. It's remarkable. The democracies of the world continue to struggle. There is only one country in this world which now gets positive media coverage across global media. And I'm not talking about Chinese media alone. We are talking about global media. So why is it that the tone of media in New Zealand and Ecuador, in India, why do they cover China so positively? It's not an organic phenomenon. It's a campaign. In fact, the data, and this is the power of data, and I also encourage to the leadership team at Republic, invest in data. People are important. They're the most important. But data by itself, while people tell you it's the new oil, crude oil is not very meaningful. It's not very useful. You have to process it, which means you really need to invest in not just data, but people who can analyze that data and show you. And data is so beautiful, it can tell you what is the origin of these positive stories on China, what is the origin of most negative news on India. You know the origin of each of those. And you can see that these are campaigns being run. There's a lot of money going into it. So to get to what the truth is, we can do all the hard work sitting in Delhi within the government. And people, in terms of the way they vote, etc., they're telling you they are happy with the situation, at least till they have better options, which they don't seem to have. But what is the role of the media then? The role of the media is to tell us as factually correct information as possible. But factually correct today doesn't mean you can just pick up a newspaper and whatever you read can be taken at face value. That the data is very compellingly telling us that there are narrative campaigns that we are up against. You therefore become an ally in this nation-building exercise. You are part of Viksit Bharat 2047. It's your job, it's your duty to then inform the citizens as factually correct information as possible. So again, we are here to, within the government, we do a lot of data work. Most of it is public. I encourage the younger team here, because the data is online, it's publicly available. I encourage you to replicate some of them. Read them, read the research, right? Because there is copious amount of research and new evidence coming out. It needs to find its way into media for the wider public to then understand and know about it. Because government is traditionally not very good with communication. Bureaucrats in particular, Amitabh is an outlier. Okay, most bureaucrats are not trained in communication. So media therefore becomes extremely important to look at the new MOSPI data, look at all these reports we are writing. Everything is open source and can be replicated. The codes are available. That's how transparent a lot of the research is. So I encourage you, I support you in propagating and talking about all these revolutionary changes that have shaped India since 2047. Thank you very much. Namaskar and good luck.
आधे बाउल दही में 4 चम्मच MDH चटनी पुदीना मसाला डाला, स्टर करो, पुदीना चटनी तैयार। MDH चटनी पुदीना मसाला।